Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers and members of the audience, thank you for joining us at this important forum organized by a leading Ukrainian law firm, AVELLUM, to discuss the risks posed by Russia to the global financial system and international businesses. I'm Valeria Melnichuk, Vice President and Highgate Advisory, and will be the convener of today's discussion. Before we get started, a few housekeeping points. This event is on the record. If you would like to ask a question you haven't asked in the registration form, please write in the comment section of YouTube Live, and we will do our best to answer as many of them as possible throughout the event. A write-up of the key insights from the discussion will be shared with all attendees. The event will also be recorded and shared with everyone who has registered. While many steps have already been taken to limit and manage the risks created by Russia's illicit activities, we know that more action is needed. We look forward to exploring this topic in more detail in the next few hours. But first, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Honorable Minister of Finance of Ukraine, Sergii Marchenko. Minister Marchenko has worked tirelessly not only to maintain the stability of the Ukrainian financial system and ensure international financial support for Ukraine, but also to share his insights on the risks Russia poses to global financial security and all actors transacting with Russia. Over to you, Honorable Minister.
Thank you for the invitation to be part of this discussion. I'm pleased, I'm grateful for invitation. Dear guest and audience online, it's great to be here today. We appreciate the assistance we have received from our allies, who by helping Ukraine also contribute to their own security and global stability. Since Russia's unprovoked invasion almost 2 years ago, we have been enduring a campaign of terror, with constant missile and drone attacks on our peaceful cities and villages, not to mention the unspeakable war crimes that our civilians have suffered at the hands of the Russian army. Thousands of Ukrainian children forcefully deported to Russia. We remain steadfast in our belief that we will defeat Russia for the benefit of Ukraine and for the sake of European and global security. War is a severe shock, but the resilience of economy and business is remarkable. GDP growth has been higher than expected, and last year we reached 5% of GDP growth, and also we managed to decrease the level of inflation from 26.6 in 2022 to 5.1% last year. The tax revenues have returned to the pre-war level. This, of course, is a fragile balance because we rely on support from our partners, and we continue to rely on this support this year and in the perspective. We are confident that our partners will continue to support Ukraine as we will continue to stand against the violent aggression. Also, Ukraine is not only effectively countering Russia on land and sea, but we have also shown determination and agreed on reforms such as harmonization of our legislation with EU. We have taken necessary steps to improve customs and tax system in line with the EU legislation, simplifying procedures, introducing an electronic system of monitoring the movement of goods, and increasing efficiency and transparency of tax administration. We continue to implement laws to meet international standards on anti-money laundering, strengthening monitoring and control over financial transactions, and increasing transparency. For example, Ukraine's anti-money laundering and political exposed person legislation has been brought in line with the FATF standards. We have one of the most sophisticated systems for beneficial ownership disclosure. While many countries only started creating centralized registers of beneficial owners, Ukraine is already actively verifying ultimate beneficial owner to ensure transparency and reduce opportunities for corruption and financial crimes. We continuously improve the enforcement of international conventions on fighting corruption and intensify the international exchange of information to counter financial crimes. As Ukraine's three-day war approaches a two-year mark, there is no denying that Ukraine outperformed and continues to outperform everybody's expectations. At the same time, Russia plunges into the deepening hole of lawlessness and corruption, threatening the global financial system and international businesses. To name just a few growing risks, Russia is intensifying cooperation with North Korea. Russia's cooperation with Iran is also rising to new heights. Countless investigations have found Russia is unable to cooperate with various terrorist and sanction groups, including Wagner, Taliban, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Assad regime, among others. Last summer, Putin to fully financing Wagner terrorists directly from the state budget, Putin admitted. Russia is loosening anti-money laundering regulation and implementing existing standards arbitrarily when it suits political purposes. Russia has created numerous illicit networks for sanction evasion using shell companies, FSB, curate intermediaries, and third countries as hubs. Their priority at the moment is dual-use goods and technologies, as their military-industrial complex is completely reliant on Western tech and struggling to support its disastrous failed invasion. So, any components, machines, or technologies that can be reproduced for military use have a high potential to end up in Russia if proper risk analysis and mitigation strategies are not implemented. Malicious cyber activities continues to emanate from Russia. Corruption and state capture of organized crime is another risk for anyone transacting with Russia directly or indirectly. Some of the very important practical risks Russia poses include increasing non-transparency and closure of public records outside of Russia, which makes due diligence, investigation, and compliance extremely challenging. The difference between a usual risky jurisdiction with weak institution and incapable system for the prevention of financial crimes and Russia is that in Russia, not compliance with international standards and the prevalence of financial crime is a conscious state policy choice. The global community has already done a lot to restrict Russia's ability to continue its invasion and restrict its influence on the global financial system. Sanctions imposed by Western countries, organizations dedicated to ensuring the safety of the financial system, such as the Edmond Group and Moneyval, have terminated their relationship with Russia. FATF suspended Russia membership and highlighted the risk it poses, and the European Parliament has designated Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. Next month, members of the Financial Action Task Force will gather in Paris. On eve of the two-year anniversary of Russia's barbaric invasion, and we hope they will consider further restrictive measures to counter Russia's risks. FATF should acknowledge the damage that Russia has done to the global financial system, recognize the risk it continues to pose, and blacklist it. The EU, G7, and other nations committed to rule-based international order should recognize the risk Russia possesses to the integrity of the global financial system. They must also set some acts which put Russia on their respective high-risk jurisdictions, list, issue relevant markets guidance, and enhance their national financial crime regulation to counter Russia's threats. For too long, Russia has been allowed to undermine the system from the inside. The rules-based international order can only survive if violators are held accountable. The time has come to use effective mechanisms to their fullest extent to protect the global financial system and international business from growing Russia risks. Business, at the same time, should understand the vast and evolving risk Russia possesses beyond sanction circumvention and put effective system in place to analyze these risks, to protect their operations and stay on the right side of history. Today, you will hear from experts from a variety of backgrounds. I hope the insight is valuable and sparks useful conversation and discussions, and we rely on you and your support in further decision making Russia to be listed in your proper place in history. Thank you very much. I hope you have a good conversation today.
Thank you, Honourable Minister, for this insightful speech and all the work you and your team are doing. Thank you and have a great day. We will continue our discussion. Now we'll turn to Matej Roska, a journalist who specializes in international politics, economic crime and investigations, and who has published stories with the BBC, Washington Post and The Guardian, among other media. He is a founder of Reporter London journalism agency and a correspondent for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Matej will lead the discussion on terrorism financing, money laundering and cybercrimes, the business risks posed by Russia. Let's give him a warm welcome. Matej, over to you.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you to the Finance Minister for his remarks. Thank you for the introduction. I'll go ahead and introduce the speakers for today. There's Tom Keatinge, Director for the Center of Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, the famous think tank in London. There's David Carlisle, Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Elliptic. And I have it here that David worked at OFAC before he joined Elliptic, which is, of course, very interesting. OFAC being the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is in charge of sanctions for the United States government. And there's Anna Gumowska, Global Head of Investigations at G3, an investigative consultancy. And Vadim Medvedev, a partner and Head of Tax and Litigation Practices at AVELLUM. Before I get into the questions, I'll start asking Tom a couple of questions. But first, I would like to raise a couple of news items that just came to my attention. Turkey was one of the main outlets for trade with Russia, even after sanctions. And there was news yesterday that Turkey will stop its banking relationships with sanctioned Russian entities after the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, paid a visit there and had a discussion with the leadership. Now, we don't know what the incentive was, or maybe some of the guests do know, but I don't. And I just wonder what that tells us and what could be done about other countries that refused to implement sanctions on Russia. And as the minister also remarked, North Korea, we had a visit from the foreign minister of North Korea to Moscow. She doesn't go out much, but she did go to Russia this time. And following the visit, Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for the Kremlin, said that Russia and North Korea are developing their cooperation in economics and across the board, and including in sensitive areas. So that's a quote. The sensitive areas obviously are military weapons and stuff that North Korea is supposed to be sanctioned for. So again, I would like our guests to explain what all of this means for the sanctions regime for FATF. North Korea is blacklisted on FATF. So what does that tell us about Russia and about the sanctions regime in general? And now for Tom, the first question on top of these notes would be about RUSI's paper a few months ago about Russia's risks to the global financial system, the inherent risks of working with Russia. What does that mean for the integrity of the global financial system, and what does it mean for international businesses to continue having exposure to the Kremlin, basically? Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction, and thanks to you all for inviting me. I'm going to start by addressing the 2 points that you raised about Turkey and DPRK, because it helps me then go into the bigger question that you asked. So it's pretty clear that the Turkish banks realized that since December the 22nd, the United States is no longer prepared to play soft on banks that facilitate sanctions evasion. So the amendment, the executive order amendment from December the 22nd, basically said, we're going to come after you as foreign financial institutions if you are found to be facilitating sanctions evasion. Now, I am pretty certain the US Treasury knows full well what that list of banks is, or at least banks that it would go after. And I'm pretty certain that some of those will be in Turkey. And I'm pretty certain that US Treasury and State Department will have made it clear to the Turkish leadership that the US authorities are not messing around any longer. I think the US has been very patient. I wrote about this for RUSI, published just last week. The US has been extremely patient and allowed the EU to sort of take the visible lead on all of this, but it's clear that patience at Treasury has run out. And so I would, and leads me to one of the points I wanted to make, which is that we've spent 2 years tiptoeing around Russia when it comes to sanctions activity, and it is time, way beyond time, to actually start taking some action against those that facilitate evasion, and meaningful action. And that meaningful action starts with banks. And if those are critical banks to the economy of someone like Turkey, then they've had 2 years to learn the lesson, and it's high time they fell into line. So that's the first point I'd make. The second point is on DPRK. Now, this is interesting because one of the things, of course, people talk about when it comes to discussions related to Russia is that, well, this is an illegal war. We recognize it's an illegal war in Ukraine, but it's nothing to do with us, say, countries that are not aligned with Ukraine's allies, the G7 and others. Now, when it comes to dealing in the kinds of trade that Russia is dealing in with DPRK already, that is in breach of UN Security Council resolutions. So there is no dispute here about whether this is, some sort of one part of the world against another part of the world. These are resolutions that have been signed up to by all countries around the world. And therefore, if you come from a country which has thus far said, you know what, we're not going to implement the EU sanctions or the UK sanctions or US sanctions or Australian or Canadian sanctions on Russia, that's your sovereign choice. It's not a choice that I would approve of, but it's your sovereign choice. But you are required to implement UN Security Council resolutions. And so this, I think, is an entree into discussions with countries that have so far chosen to turn a blind eye to what Russia is doing. And engaging with DPRK, funding their WMD program by buying weapons from them. There's a whole load of things that Russia is doing which are in breach of UN Security Council resolutions. We should be picking up on that. The general point I wanted to make, and then I'll close, the general point I wanted to make is that we have become, as my intervention indicates, we have become obsessed with sanctions on Russia. And that obsession is understandable, and that obsession is important, and it needs to become more intense. But let's think about risks. And this was the point of the roundtable we had that you referred to the report from. Let's think about risks, not just risks related to sanctions if you are a business outside Russia, but let's think about the risks that you are running in facilitating other forms of financial crime, other forms of corruption, money laundering, moving illicit finance into the financial system. There's a much bigger pool of risk out there than just simply, am I facilitating sanctions circumvention or or evasion. And I think that's something that we need to talk much more about. Organizations that focus on business operations that companies have in or with Russia, I think need to be supported in raising that much further up the agenda, because the focus on sanctions, in my view, risks eclipsing thinking about these broader risks related to financial crime. And obviously one of the things that you want to talk about is terrorist financing. So that would be those would be my opening thoughts.
Right. Thank you. Now, can you give some examples of how it would be possible for a business to gain exposure to, say, North Korea, or a terror group like Wagner? Because we know that Putin has taken ownership, or acknowledged financing Wagner through the Kremlin budget last summer. So I suppose by dealing with any major Russian company, Gazprom, or whatever it is, you risk your money becoming part of this relationship with someone like Wagner, or with someone like North Korea. Isn't that right?
Well, I'd turn it around, and it's a question that Anna will probably want to address, given what she does. But how can you be certain? How can you be certain who you're dealing with in that environment? You simply cannot be certain who you're dealing with. And if there is any certainty, it's because you'll be dealing with an entity that's sanctioned and on a list and all the rest of it. But I mean, that's the tip of the iceberg. So I think that the question to any business that has any legacy engagement with Russia is, what certainty can you evidence that you're not dealing with an organization which is either taking advantage of you, manipulating you, or is, if not directly with you, involved in nefarious activity, is part of a network which is dealing in nefarious activity itself. So I think the minister put it very, very eloquently. He said, it's a lawless environment, and the pursuit of illicit activities is a state policy choice. And you, therefore, if you choose to deal with that state, you are almost certainly part of a lawless environment. Do you want to be?
Right. And that's just the sort of thing that we are supposed to be having FATF to guard against. So what does this all mean for FATF? What do you think FATF should do, or what is it expected to do in a situation like this?
So the FATF is caught between a rock and a hard place. It will sit there and say it's a technical body, it's a technical body, it's a technical body. It has taken made political decisions in the past. Frankly, it's high time FATF acted. I think the minister also mentioned the fact that countries shouldn't stand around waiting for FATF. I find it extraordinary that, for example, in the UK, there is a high-risk jurisdictions list. And at this point, at least in the Annex the anti-money laundering regulations, I think is where it is. Russia is not there yet. Why is that not the case? Why do we have to stand around and wait for the FATF to tell companies that Russia is a high risk? You don't need the FATF to tell you that. You should know yourself. So it would be great to see the FATF act. What we should be doing is making clear to countries that typically take the FATF decisions and then implement them into their own legislation, to say, don't wait for the FATF, right? You don't need to wait for the FATF. There's plenty of evidence that suggests that Russia is a risk to your country, to the integrity of the businesses in your country, and you should be therefore taking action immediately. It would be great to see the FATF take action. Maybe it will in February, as the minister referred to, but let's not stand around and use the FATF as an excuse for inaction.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And now I'm going to move to David. Elliptic is one of the top cyber consulting firms, and they also deal with crypto. In Russia, we have the infamous example of Garantex, a crypto exchange that, according to media coverage, has worked with all sorts of illegal and terrorist organizations. I wonder if David can give us an update, not just on crypto, but in general, ransomware, cybercrime of all kinds from Russia. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I certainly think it's no secret that a huge amount of cybercrime originates, and for the past couple of decades has originated from Russia, and that's certainly nothing new. I think that you did, mention there, and the vantage point from which we tend to work on this topic at Elliptic is the use of cryptocurrencies among the cybercriminal ecosystem in Russia on a growing scale. And over the past few years, we've seen the scale of that usage increase fairly substantially. And I'd say there are two broad ways we see crypto playing a role in the Russian cybercrime ecosystem. So firstly, we see cybercriminal groups based in Russia attempting to raise funds in crypto in order to profit from their activities. Secondly, we see that cybercriminals from outside of Russia leverage the Russia-based crypto ecosystem to engage in activities like money laundering. So I'll give you some examples of each. So, when it comes to cyber criminals in Russia using crypto, really the major type of crime we do observe these days is ransomware attacks, whereby cyber criminals will compromise a victim's systems and data and demand payment in crypto to restore access. Russian cyber criminal groups are at this stage notorious for deploying a ransomware technique known as big game hunting, which involves targeting attacks at especially critical infrastructure. So attacking hospitals, parts of the energy grid, and demanding huge payments from victims into the millions of dollars, which are almost always made in Bitcoin. Now, we see that single Russian cybercrime groups have raised hundreds of millions of dollars in crypto-denominated ransomware payments in some instances through these types of attack. And a big part of what enables them to be successful in profiting from these crimes is a complementary ecosystem of cryptocurrency exchange services that essentially specialize in helping Russian cyber criminals to convert the crypto they generate from their crimes into Russian rubles. So these crypto exchange services, which typically operate out of Russia and or through front entities located in parts of Eastern Europe. You mentioned an entity known as Garantex, which change that the U.S. The U.S. Treasury OFAC sanctioned a couple of years ago for facilitating activity on behalf of ransomware attackers. It was actually registered through Latvia and facilitating onward transfers of crypto into Russia. These types of exchanges are really effectively subject to few, if any, regulations at all, and really are effectively complicit in laundering funds on behalf of Russian cyber criminals. Now, to the second point I raised earlier, these Russia-linked crypto exchanges and services don't just help Russian cyber criminals to launder their funds. They also help cyber criminals, and I think, as you alluded to, other criminals for that matter, from other parts of the world to launder their funds. And so this actually gets to a point you raised earlier around North Korea. And we have seen numerous, and I'd say increasing instances of North Korean cyber criminals laundering funds in crypto through Russian crypto exchanges. And I don't necessarily think that's to do with state-level collusion between Russia and North Korea per se, but rather that cyber criminals tend to sort of congregate in the same places and utilize a lot of the same infrastructure. And because this is so the cyber criminal and crypto kind of laundering ecosystem is so concentrated in Russia, we do see things like North Korean cyber criminals utilizing the same infrastructure as well. So essentially with Russia, you have domestic cyber criminal groups that rely on crypto to profit from crimes, but also on infrastructure that enables cyber criminals from all over the world to launder their crypto through Russia. This is really becoming an increasing focus of the U.S. Treasury in particular, which has taken a number of actions, not just the Garantex action, but against a number of other crypto exchanges to try to disrupt this activity. But I think to one of Tom's points, while crypto is maybe playing a larger role than ever before in the Russian cybercrime ecosystem, we can't lose sight of other things. And you see Russia just undertaking things like denial of service attacks and all sorts of other cybercrime, fraud, attacks on the banking system that don't necessarily involve cryptocurrencies, that incur in fiat currencies or might involve the euro. So I mean, it's happening across the board, but I'd say the cryptocurrencies is probably the most recent and
right. Well, very informative. Thanks very much. Just one observation. I think Garantex was registered originally in Estonia rather than Latvia. So just,
sorry, apologies for that. There are a couple other exchanges OFAC targeted that were.
No problem. No, just so we're clear, because it was in Estonia. And I also had a follow-up about the role of regulators in Western countries, in Europe, in the US, Canada, and so forth. Regulators, governments, law enforcement, what can they do? And what are they not doing enough of at the moment?
So, I mean, one of the issues here revolves around a topic we've already talked about, the FATF, Financial Action Task Force. So, when it comes certainly to the crypto component of this, one major challenge the international community faces is that now Russia and many other countries as well really don't have any meaningful measures in place to try to prevent money laundering and sanctions evasion in crypto. The FATF has published specific guidance describing how countries should apply its AML standards to the crypto space. But unfortunately, many countries around the world still are failing to regulate crypto effectively and in line with the FATF standards. So that means crypto exchanges around the world frequently can operate really without having to face any consequences or implement any meaningful anti-money laundering control requirement controls. Now, one way that the U.S. in particular is a bit as Tom, the U.S. Treasury has just gotten fed up with waiting for the rest of the world and has started taking unilateral actions to sanction Russian crypto exchanges that facilitate cybercrimes. I think these sanctions are important, but they do. So, for example, while it's great that the U.S. and to a lesser extent the EU and UK have now started to take some actions targeting the sort of Russian ransom. Many countries around the world are not doing that, which means it's possible for these cyber criminals to dodge those sanctions. I think additionally, to the extent the US and UK and EU have taken some actions, especially with respect to sanctions, to target, say, the ecosystem, those have been aided. They've mostly been done in isolation, and they aren't necessarily lined up as effectively as I think they could be. So, to get back to the earlier point, I think one of the key lessons needs to be that countries should not be FATF or organizations like it to move, but those countries that are minded to move to act against crimes like ransomware emanating from Russia should be trying to act in concert with one another. So I'd really love to see the US and EU and UK get more joined up in that way.
Right. Thanks so much, David. I'm going to move on to Anna. She consults clients, corporates on all of these matters. So I would like to ask, how have you seen these companies navigating the ream of new regulations, and how do they try to stay clear of these risks, organized crime, terrorism, finance, and money laundering and all the rest of it? And if possible, without breaking any contracts, could you give us some concrete examples, please? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Matej, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to speak alongside such distinguished panelists. The short answer to your question, Matej, on how companies and organizations mitigate those risks is with great difficulty. I think it has become more difficult than ever to understand both the types of risks that companies face dealing with not only sanctioned entities, but Russian entities or entities connected with Russia, to focus on those to start with. And as Tom pointed out in his remarks, the risk of breaching a sanction or sanctions per se is probably the smallest of those risks. It's the associated risks of terrorist financing, of illicit trade, of contributing, broadly speaking, to the Russian financial system, and therefore the financing of the war in Ukraine. These are the risks that clients really face and think about, and the risks that we try and help them understand and mitigate. I think in our work, in the kind of investigations and consulting work, if you look back 10, 15 years, doing a sanctions check on someone was probably one of the most boring things one could do, and it was almost like a routine check that you would run someone's name through the OFAC list, through the EU list, and so on and so forth. Now it's far from it. It is the key question when naturally dealing with Russian entities or persons connected with Russia, but also crucially we're dealing with other entities incorporated in third jurisdictions. So, for example, even in countries of the European Union or countries in Europe, states in the US, let alone countries in the Middle East, or countries or companies incorporated in countries in Africa, and trying to think that to understand the connections. As actually the minister pointed out, and I'm glad he said that, is that we can no longer rely on any information that comes out of Russia, right? The public record there is completely unreliable. It is manipulated. It's not updated. Even if you can access it, which sometimes can be very difficult through restrictions on access to the databases themselves from outside of Russia, anything that we find in those records is probably not going to be true. So even at the first step, we have the big challenge of understanding whether the information that we're seeing is actually correct. The challenges, just to give a couple of examples, are really varied. So it is from what we would probably all consider a relatively straightforward question of, is the counterparty that I'm dealing with in any way connected to a sanctioned entity, or indeed to any other Russian entity or a Russian actor? This is a question that we get asked regularly by our clients. Obviously, these are not sanctioned entities because per se, but trying to understand, for example, how a corporate structure of a particular entity has changed in light of the sanctions. And working, and I'm sure Vadim would have a lot to add on that from the legal side, but working to understand to what level and when the sanctions would be applicable and whatnot. The more complex version of that is trying to look at trusts. A lot of as a kind of follow up or as a result of sanctions being implemented, a lot of Russian companies or Russian investors claim to have put their assets or their companies into blind trusts so that they are not impacted by sanctions, trying to help clients understand whether these trusts are indeed blind and whether there is indeed no influence or no control over these assets or these businesses by sanctioned individuals and sanctioned companies. And I think on the opposite spectrum of that is looking at things like shipments of oil and trying to understand whether, and I guess that is linked to the question about Iran and North Korea that we were discussing briefly, whether oil and a shipment of oil on a particular tanker really does not contain any Russian oil. If your client is an oil trader, that is a very important question to them, and determining whether at any point in time did it contain any Russian oil or actually in this example probably Iranian oil. So these are the types of questions that we're trying to answer or help our clients answer. And as a final point on that, I think the side effect, which I personally think is a positive effect of a lot of this, is that clients tend to de-risk. Right? Because some of these questions are so difficult to answer and so difficult to get to a level of certainty, to Tom's point of, do you really know who you're dealing with? That often the result of that is not to deal with those people at all. And I personally would like to see a little bit more of that because I think that is the broader effect of sanctions that we're seeing.
Right. Well, I would counter a little bit by saying that in certain businesses, in commodities, oil, fertilizers, even natural gas, atomic energy, Rosatom is still huge and global. And so in these types of businesses, Russia is kind of inevitable. And aluminum. I could go on with this. And it's really these markets are, unfortunately, because of what Russia has become, these markets would really not function properly without Russia. So if you want to be in these markets, you have to deal with Russia. And now Russia is in geopolitical military alliance openly with North Korea and Iran. So what does that really mean? I mean, if do your clients risk if they sell something to one of these unsanctioned giant Russian companies, does that mean that product might end up used by Iran or North Korea in their development of weapons or financing of terrorism and so forth?
Yes, I mean, first of all, I completely agree with your point about there being certain industries where my suggestion of de-risking and not dealing with those entities is just impossible, right? Because of the role that Russia and Russian companies play in these markets. I think you've mentioned that at the beginning, the meeting between the foreign minister of North Korea and the Russian minister in Moscow. There was also reports, I think yesterday or this morning, following the meeting between President Putin and the Iranian President RUSI back in December, that there are reports over the last couple of days about a new agreement being signed between Russia and Iran. I think the content of that agreement is being described very similarly to that one with North Korea. So that yes, there'll be cooperation alongside, across multiple areas, including sensitive areas. I think that the risk has always been understood, or certainly has been understood over the last 2 years, where the relationships between Russia and Iran and Russia and North Korea have become closer than before. And I think that while understand it just adds another layer of complexity. So not only how does certain dealings with again unsanctioned Russian entity, how do they relate to Russia, the financing of Russian activities, but then also how do they relate to Iran, how do they relate to North Korea? And just to give an example, I mean, we were asked the question over a year ago now, I would say, by a client in one of the sub-Saharan African countries, who wanted to understand whether there is any risks that payments that this client is making for security, private security on the ground in this country, could be connected or could somehow be going to the Wagner Group because of the role that the Wagner Group plays in the private security world in certain African countries. So I think clients are very, very conscious of that. And not only are they conscious of unwillingly breaching sanctions or unwillingly supporting terrorist organizations or unwillingly laundering the proceeds of crime, but also crucially, they're very aware of the reputational impact of even a slightest suggestion that there might be. And I think that's another level that we could discuss on its own, I think, as a separate subject of discussion, but one that is also very, very important to our clients, that even a slight perception point could be really detrimental to their business and their reputation for good reasons.
Right. Yes. So it does sound like we're in a kind of new unexplored territory. It's all very chaotic, all very hard to understand and hard to read, and even with what were supposed to be clear-cut examples of pariah states like Iran and North Korea, all of a sudden Russia has let them into the world by the back door, it seems, and it seems we're still not quite clear how that impacts the rest of the world. I'm going to move on to Vadim now. As a legal expert, he can probably give us the three top sort of most important bullet points of risks that we should think about when we think of Russia's involvement in the global financial system. Vadim?
Thank you so much, Matej. And being conscious of time, I still would like to make two short remarks on what previous distinguished speakers said. A first short remark regarding Tom's reference that some of his vis-a-vis were mentioning that there is sort of a legal war in Ukraine, of Russia against Ukraine. And it is important to remember that there is nothing legal about that war, and that Russia may not try to turn the names. What Russia is doing is terrorism financing. What Russia is doing is terroristic acts. It is not the act of legal war according to the world-based order we have in place since 1945. That is the first comment, and please let's remember that. Another
Sorry,
one
Vadim,
is,
to interrupt.
yeah.
I said illegal. To be very clear, I said illegal. In no way did I say legal. That's a ridiculous thing for me to say.
Thank you, Tom. I understand that you would not say such thing anyway. You were just referring to someone, and good to clarify that.
No, I wasn't. I said that these countries recognize that the war is illegal,
Perfect.
but they choose not to align with the sanctions. Sorry, please don't misquote me.
Yes, sorry for that, and thank you for clarification. And another short thing which I would like to add is that the perception that Russia is unavoidable in certain markets, I believe in many instances could be a misconception. And Europe has been very efficient in tremendously decreasing supply of hydrocarbons to Europe from Russia. And it continues to do so. So maybe even if not today, but with some perception and with some passage of time, it could be achieved, and it is a goal to look at. But that is more of a political question, and sorry for making that political intervention. Coming back to what you said regarding the key risks Russia would pose for international financial system. First, I would like to refer to a global guidance which we have from the FATF, the global watchdog, which is mandated to secure the international financial system. And there are three key risks which the FATF pointed out, which are the trade with UN sanctioned countries, which are malicious cyber activity, and which is the third one is circumvention of measures introduced to protect the international financial system. These three concerns are without a doubt valid, but I'm not sure they fully show the global nature of the risks that Russia poses for the international financial system. And here I would like to repeat the conclusion of Tom's excellent paper published last summer. In that paper, there were a very meaningful discussion of Russia risks. And three key risks which were pointed out there were sanctions evasion, financial crime, especially exploiting the financial system to launder proceeds of crime, and third one, leveraging third countries to inject illicit finance into Western economies. 6 months on, these three risks are still extremely valid, and they do describe the magnitude of issue the international financial system is dealing with. But one distinctive point which turns them different from the other cases is that these three risks are the state-run and state-managed policies. It is very different, very important to understand. There is not some occasional mistake or mismanagement on the state side, but it is actually an active policy. It is a state-run machine to launder money, to finance terrorism, and to evade sanctions. One thing which we could mention to put it into perspective, and I'll quote two cases without first referencing where and when they come from. First one, US officials approved delivery of advanced semiconductor equipment to firm in Vienna, but sometime later, all this equipment found its way into the country in question because European companies didn't want to restrict trade with the country in question. One case. Second case, US imposed a fine of 3 million on the Swedish company in connection with export of radar systems to the country in question, which significantly increased this country's ability to defend itself against bombers and coordinate EU attacks against Western Europe and Central Asia. These two examples, they might seem as nowadays quotes from newspapers or nowadays quotes from professional media on sanctions and financial crime, and they are not. Both of them are from 1980s, and they refer to US imposing sanctions against and preventing USSR from getting access to Western technology. And the point is, and there are checkbook examples of how KGB was getting access to Western technology. And the point is that with all the changes in international financial system throughout these decades, FSB and Russian intelligence units remain strong actor in developing and running sanctions and prevention, terrorism financing, and money laundering schemes. And the issue is that businesses are not just facing some private mistakes and some private offenses, but they are facing the state-run organized system to allow Russian actors of doing this illicit activities in the international financial system. So the question would be, do you want to test your compliance team against the cunning and experience that are in the three risks that we have?
Right. Well, thanks very much, Vadim. That was really good, and I liked that example from the 80s that you gave. And it does seem slowly we're kind of reverting to a similar world of big blocks that are standing opposite each other, I suppose. I'll take a question from the audience now. I've got one that seems a little bit technical, but I suppose we have a technical audience, so I'll read it. If your counterparty in your business is not on the sanctions list, and the goods and services that it sells to you are not on the sanctions list, how far should you go to do due diligence against potential sanctions violations? I suppose I'm going to give this one to Anna because she probably faces these sorts of questions every day.
Thank you, Matej, and thank you for the question from the member of the audience. I guess the answer is as usual. It depends, right? So we would recommend that clients look at counterparties, whether that's suppliers or customers, regardless of whether they have any connection with Russia or not, and even outside the context of Russian sanctions, just to know who they're dealing with. So at a minimum, understanding who the beneficial owner of the company is, who is actually behind the entity, what's the track record of the entity, are they sanctioned? That's one example. Are they blacklisted anywhere else? Do they include politically exposed persons, and so on and so forth? So these are the questions that I think any responsible business should be asking before either accepting money from someone, so from a customer, or indeed paying money to someone, which I understand would be the context here, because this sounds like a supplier. So I think, and I'm sure Vadim will have a view on that. It's just a question of being consistent and having a policy that one follows consistently to provide yourself with the level of comfort that you know what you're dealing with, and then how far the checks go. that could be that would be dependent on inherent risks, which is called a risk-based approach. So it would look probably a little bit more at companies incorporated in more high-risk jurisdictions, for example. But the basics is being comfortable with knowing who you're dealing with. So the UBO, the track record of the business, any political exposure, and of course any sanctions. That would be my basic checklist.
Right, and I think this is the final one because I think we're running out of time, but there's a follow-up from the same person, from Veronika Vasinka, who is probably a lawyer by the way she's writing these questions. If you put a clause in the contract prohibiting the resale of the good in question or the service in question, the product, whatever, does that protect you from liability? And could that be a good system to make sure parallel imports and stuff like that doesn't happen? I think because David has been on the regulator's side in the past, I'm going to ask him to answer this one if possible. Sorry, David.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I don't really feel like that particular questions that especially aligned with my my expertise there, if I'm going to be honest.
Okay, Vadim, you're the legal mind.
Matej, maybe I will try to comment a bit. And we'll definitely have a separate panel on sanctions, and you can ask and tell and talk much more about sanctions the second panel. But regarding this specific one, my view would be that just having a contractual clause would not be sufficient. You should understand who your counterparty is, and whether it may have actually an illegitimate use for this type of goods, and how it all plays around. Because when, for example, Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan started to buy enormous amounts of different electronic appliances nowadays, it is quite obvious on a general sanity check that these are not actually designed and destined for final use in these Central Asian countries. They would find their way and their route to other places and other users. And just saying that I had a contractual clause would say you are not doing it, and I never bothered to check whether you are actually a bona fide business dealing with this type of goods, having customers, this is a reasonable amount of stock, etc. That would not be enough, I would say, apart if you're not doing the reasonable otherwise background check and compliance.
Right. Okay. Well, in that case, let's leave the floor for the following panel, and let's wrap it here. Thanks very much to everyone. And as a technical note, please leave the room and continue following this seminar on YouTube, because the places in the online room are limited. Thanks again, everyone, and have a nice day.
Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Matej. It has indeed been an insightful discussion, and there will be more technical details and more questions can be answered during the second panel. And right now we'll hear from Yuriy Nechayev, partner with Sanctions and Corporate Practice at AVELLUM, who will speak about the rising tide of Ukrainian sanctions. Hello, Yuriy, over to you.
Hello, Valeria, thank you. Thank you. It's been an insightful first panel on a multitude of risks Russia poses beyond sanctions. Before the second panel starts, where more discussion about sanctions and circumvention will happen, I'd like to speak about Ukrainian sanctions. I'll cover what businesses should do to avoid the negative impacts of Ukrainian sanctions on their operation and reputation, and how international businesses can use this sanctions list as a source of information to mitigate Russia-related risks. Unlike the US and the EU, which have used sanctions to target nefarious actors for decades and continuously fine-tuned their sanctions legislation, Ukraine is new to sanctions. Ukraine's first sanctions law was introduced only in 2014 in response to the illegal annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Donbass by Russia. For objective reasons, the Ukrainian sanction legislation is a work in progress, and thus is often vaguely worded, while the procedure of imposing specific sanctions is often classified. And yet, sanctions became an important tool of self-defense and national security for Ukraine. Only since the 24th of February 2022, over 12,000 entities have been included in Ukraine's formal sanctions list, making the total number of individuals and companies on the list over 16,000. And the number continues to grow. In December 2023 alone, the president of Ukraine imposed sanctions against more than 500 companies and individuals. Ukraine has several sanctions lists. One formal, which entails legal consequences, and two informal ones. The so-called waiting sanctions list on the war and sanctions database, and the list of international war sponsors. Although being on the latter two lists does not impose legal restrictions, they need to be monitored and as diligently as the formal ones, actually. So here we say that non-compliance triggers significant negative consequences. In terms of legal consequences, they can take many forms. For instance, asset blocking, confiscation, restrictions on involvement in privatization or land acquisitions. An example of reputational consequences is Raiffeisen Bank. It was listed as an international war sponsor for refusing to exit the Russian market despite its structural importance for the Russian banking sector. It caused major reputational damages and reported complications in the relationships with the American OFAC and the European Central Bank. Raiffeisen Bank even engaged in lobbying the Austrian government to withhold support for the EU sanctions against Russia until Ukraine temporarily removed the bank from the list. Another example could be the confectionery producer Mondelez International, the company behind Oreos, Toblerone, Milka. The company's stock price tumbled by almost 5% after it was labeled an international war sponsor, and the price has not recovered since. So what can businesses do to avoid risks related to Ukrainian sanctions? First, you should monitor sanctions regime and comply with it, as it is essential to avoid legal consequences. The legal landscape in Ukraine is indeed complicated, but it is still possible to navigate. In our practice, we had cases when we helped companies build a risk management assessment metrics, which would help the companies to assess the risk of breaching the Ukrainian sanctions. It informed the company's decision to make steps to reduce or negate these risks. And second, removing the risk factors from a company's operation or individual's activities prompts the Ukrainian government to respond. And when properly communicated to the authorities, this may result in the removal from the sanctions list. For example, the Ukrainian authority maintaining the war and sanctions database publishes guidelines on how to delist from this database. One of our clients, a former director of a global company's Russian division who got included into this database, decided to comply with these guidelines. Once the Ukrainian authority reviewed all the required documents we had submitted and found it satisfactory, the individual was successfully removed from the list. So finally, what can businesses learn from Ukrainian sanctions and how can they use this information for Russia risk assessment? Well, Ukrainians in general and Ukrainian authorities in particular are much closer to the source of threat. And due to this proximity, but also due to extensive knowledge of actors, behaviors, and tactics, they are often much better informed about the evolving risk emanating from Russia. This means that often, in terms of sanctions, Ukraine is several steps ahead of the sanctions coalition, which then catches up. For example, in the first year of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine introduced sanctions against a number of Russian companies linked to the military-industrial complex. They were only subsequently sanctioned by the EU and the US. Moreover, sanction lists put together by Ukraine are usually communicated to its partners and allies, and may thus influence sanctions coalition's risk assessment and decision-making processes. As we all see, there is no sign of Russia's miraculous awakening. They continue to mindlessly pound on our cities and our homes with missiles and drones. They intensify dangerous cooperation with rogue states and non-state actors around the world, and they further aggravate the tyrant grip on the legal and financial system inside the country. Most likely, the risks Russia poses will only increase if not countered effectively, and Ukrainian sanctions response will also escalate. This means that companies will continue to be impacted if they are not meticulously careful about Russia's risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuriy. Indeed, Ukrainian sanctions can be a useful source of information when assessing Russia-related risks. I will now give the floor to Chris Cook, senior reporter at the Financial Times, who has been covering economic measures against Russia and Belarus in the wake of the full-scale invasion. Chris has previously worked as a lead writer, education correspondent, and comment editor at the FT, and also spent 5 years at BBC Newsnight as its public policy editor. Chris will moderate the discussion on how regulated firms should approach the risk of sanctions and financial crime. Over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. I'll start by quickly just introducing our panel, who know actual things rather than bluffing like me. We're very lucky to have John Cusack, who's the chair of the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime. We have Jane Shvets, who's a partner in Debevoise and Plimpton's White Collar and Regulatory Defence Group. We have Wilbert Luna Arellanes, who is a lawyer at Whiting Case. We have Justine Walker, who's the Global Head of Sanctions Compliance and Risk at the Association of Certified and Anti-Money Laundering Specialists. What I'm hoping we can talk about today is really where we are at this moment. Things have changed a little bit in the last month and a bit with the new measures introduced by the US, particularly for regulated companies, an executive order at the end of December. I think we're starting to see some impact for all. There's sort of murmurings coming out of the Russian press that they're actually already biting. We are also getting used to this new landscape about what it means to deal with Russia. So I wonder if I can start with John. John, you published your Russia financial crime dashboard in July, which if any of our viewers haven't seen, is a remarkable thing that's worth Googling. It's an incredible rap sheet that you've put together for Russia with everything from embezzlement and drug trafficking, financial fraud. I mean, you do really paint a picture of a gangster state, really, for want of a better term. John, do you think that those risks have changed over the last year? Do you think, how has your position on Russia changed since last year?
Thanks, Chris. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep.
So look, I've been working in banks for 30 years, leading financial crime teams, some very large institutions. We've always had Russia as a high-risk bank in the whole of the period that I've been involved. Don't think it's been as high risk as it is today, quite frankly. And I think that there are some differences that mean that it's more risky dealing with Russia than it's ever been previously. But as to the dashboard in July 2023, I don't think anyone's surprised of it. I mean, people have talked about this already. The minister talked about it. If you take Russia and you compare it to many other countries, yeah, of course it's a big country that's going to have drug trafficking, it's going to have human trafficking, it's going to have the usual stuff. But Russia has, it's a top 5 almost for every single predicate offence, all the large ones, and it's it's a leader in things like cybercrime, which David was talking about in the last panel. It's also, one of the world's second largest arms dealer. We know how corrupt that is as an industry and how dangerous it is. And we also know with the connections to North Korea, with WMD proliferation, and then also connections with terrorism finance, how particularly egregious the activities of the Russian state are. Nevertheless, even with my dashboard, when you compare it from a financial crime threats perspective, and then also the response, the nature of the response, and FATF come out with essentially say it's medium threat and high response. My dashboard and other views, I'm sure, would describe it as very high threat and low response, albeit there is some response. It's very selective. And of course, that just reflects the fact that you've got autocracy, you've got corruption, you've got criminality. When you do compare it to other countries, though, it doesn't look that different from a statistical point of view to places like Mexico, to places like Turkey, and places like China, who are all FATF member countries as well. So I think whilst we're talking a lot about Russia here and Russia's problems, one of the big challenges of targeting only Russia with this is it's not the only place that has similar kinds of problems that are big countries and people deal with them. So I think that's kind of a real challenge I think we've got to focus on, and not just focus on Russia as being extra special. It is, but it's not so extra special compared to everywhere else, or some other places anywhere at least.
And we've got the Financial Action Task Force plenary coming up in February. So what are you expecting to come out of that? Do you think things are going to be much as they were? Do you think there's anything new that we need to worry about?
Well, it depends on your perspective. I don't see FATF changing its position anytime soon. I think to do so, they would have to change some fundamental tenets as to how they have seen the world and how they've reported on it for the last couple of decades. I mean, we all know that essentially FATF underweight the threats because the biggest threats of fighting financial crime and money laundering actually in the largest economies in the world. And that's not to decry those particular countries. I mean, Janet Yellen last December said the US was likely the largest money laundering jurisdiction in the world, which is probably right. That doesn't mean the US should be put on the list, because its response is not uncommensurate with the threat that it's got, and it's also not, a criminal state in the way that, or at all, and in the way that the Russian state is. So there's a difference there. So it underweights the threats. It also overweights the response, and of course in Global South the response is much less than in Global North, and therefore if you're from a smaller country and those are perceived to have large threats, particularly Africa and the Global South, and you have a less than adequate response, you end up on the grey list, whereas the large industrial countries generally don't. So I don't expect that, because it would go fundamentally to changes that they're not prepared to make, of course.
So can I ask how you think sanctions have bitten so far? So how far they have been successful in encountering the specific risks around Russia?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Tom mentioned and you mentioned the 22nd of December sanctions. I mean, this might be a bit of a game changer. It reminds me back in 2004, 2005, when the US turned up all around the world, the US Secretary of Treasury, and I remember meeting him in Switzerland, and he was encouraging everyone to get out of Iran. And that policy, even though it wasn't legal sanctions in Europe at that stage, and in Switzerland at that stage, and in the East in that stage, it was a very successful policy, because it was a policy that was had some efficacy in relation to the underlying criminality and threat, but it also had a very clear message that if you don't, you won't be able to bank in the US dollar banking system. And I think that sanction on financial institutions, which is now being passed, will make a lot of people think, and a lot of people will have to take action. It is an extremely broad piece of sanction if you look at it. In theory, it can pick up the innocent easily. And there's the sense that the innocent aren't going to get targeted. It's going to be the ones that Tom mentioned, who people know who they are, and they know who they are, and they have a very large shot across their bows right now.
I wonder if it's worth just quickly saying, for the benefit of people who are not as avid readers of the executive order production line as people on this call, that we're talking about the 22nd of December executive order that was issued by Biden's White House, which gave an authorization for the imposition of sanctions on foreign banks, basically foreign financial institutions that conduct any transaction or allow effectively the financing of the moving of goods, materials, technology, defense material that relates anything that touches the manufacturing, aerospace, this sort of classical sanction sectors, and anything that touches the military industrial base. And the hope there is that things like the foreign direct product regulations haven't managed to sort of stop particularly American goods reaching Russia, but maybe by attacking the financing of those transactions, that we can have a sort of bigger effect. And I think the Kommersant has run a story today basically saying they think Turkish banks have suddenly become very frightened of touching Russian customers. So there is a sort of beginnings of the signs that maybe this is going to be a thing that has real effect.
Yeah, I think,
sorry,
Chris, I mean, just on that, it's not just the financing. I mean, you can facilitate a payment through your financial institution and not know that it's involved with this. That could trigger. Now, it's unlikely that because you don't know and you're not supporting that the US would take action, but within the statutes, I mean, our colleagues can tell us more about that. But it is a pretty broad set of powers. And it just strikes me that what we've got here is we've got a lot of the world that doesn't want to follow with the sanctions against Russia. And this is a mechanism for persuading not the governments of the world, but the ones who have connections by the US dollar to the US to persuade them to take unilateral action in their own for their own survival instincts in order to be able to extend, Western sanctions or US sanctions to those countries that don't want to apply them. I support it, but it's it remains to be seen whether it's effective or not.
I think it's. I think we've also. I've heard sort of people talking about Chinese banks as well suddenly becoming quite edgy. Yeah, it is the sort of background at this particular moment. So Wilbert, I wonder if I could come to you. Can I ask what I mean? We're obviously in this rapidly changing moment, but can I ask what you think the major challenges there are for compliance when it comes to sanctions with Russia? And we had a question in the previous session about what the right level of checking people need to do about compliance. I think that's something for us maybe to pick up on.
Of course, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much to AVELLUM for the invitation. First of all, I would like to stress that the following statements and views are my own and do not necessarily represent those of any organizations that I may be associated with. Now, regarding to the challenges that arise for businesses in compliance with sanctions against the Russian Federation, the first one is the series of difficulties around the disentanglement of operations in or connected with such nation. Aside from any considerations on Russia's geopolitical importance, it must be noted that before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Russian economy was highly interconnected in terms of international trade. For example, according to information analyzed by Harvard University, in 2021, Russia was a country exporting significant amounts of products to different regions of the world, including China, the Netherlands, and Germany, which were the top 3 export destinations of Russia back then, as well as to other jurisdictions like the United States of America and the United Kingdom. Additionally, from the international finance standpoint, Moscow was considered a leading financial center both in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, for example, by the Global Financial Centers Index, having improved its ranking in that index as compared with previous editions thereof, and had been recognized as one of the 50 leading fintech centers in the world. All this indicates that the Russian economy, before the invasion, had a role of global importance and that many businesses had connections therewith. Accordingly, it will not be easy, and it is not easy nor quick, to disentangle economic relations, especially in what can be seen as a very volatile environment. The second challenge that I see arising for businesses in compliance with sanctions against Russia is that the current geopolitical situation evolves very rapidly, and so do sanctions. So businesses need to be very attentive and aware of any changes, particularly in terms of the imposition of more stringent measures versus the Russian Federation. The sanctions that have been imposed against Russia have been issued, for example, in different moments and through different packages pertaining to diverse jurisdictions. Furthermore, each of them has very specific objectives. For example, some aim at hindering the movement of assets in order to prevent certain individuals and legal entities from hiding them, while others restrict the sale of goods or technologies that could be used for military purposes. Therefore, staying on top of the situation, even just from the legal standpoint, and without referring to the current geopolitical situation, can be very, very difficult. This obviously adds to the significant legal, operational, and compliance risks derived from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, a step that companies can take for their own protection is to seek the advice of legal and compliance experts for purposes of mitigation. This may include, for example, conducting extensive background checks on subjects and operations to see the degree of risk of being used to circumvent sanctions against Russia. It is also important to bear in mind that indiscriminate de-risking never constitutes a due measure to tackle financial crime or sanctions risk, nor a proper application of, for example, the global standards against financial crime issued by the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF. In an ever-changing scenario, it is very important for businesses to have a longer-term view and a strategy in accordance with it, not just responding to immediate demands. In this regard, complying with the law, and particularly with sanctions-related regulations, is a much better business strategy than not doing so, even if that can represent commercial challenges in the short term. Businesses are recommended. Oh, go ahead. I
was going to say, can I ask you a bit about the grey areas a little bit? So if you're advising someone who's selling, who suddenly found they've got a new buyer of microchips in China or something that's, the China, the Turkey, the UAE.
I think Chris froze, right? So I guess we will be coming back with his question, but the is to businesses advice in order to assess, understand, and mitigate any possible risks arising from sanctions derived from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Conducting risk assessments properly, as well as implementing measures to mitigate possible risks, is not an easy task that can be taken lightly in this sense.
I think we've lost Chris, so I will step in for a minute while we're waiting for him to join. I think what he also wanted to ask was the grey areas and how far we should go, especially in the risk sectors, if new clients are popping up in the jurisdictions that we know are aiding Russia. And here the question would be, oh, Chris, are you back? I think he is struggling with connection, so we will maybe move to Jane and ask a question. What do you think are the main financial crime and compliance risks associated with the Russian jurisdiction that you would identify for kind of the next period for 2024 or the upcoming? Oh, Chris is back. Chris, we've lost you.
My apologies. You can see I'm in a generic European hotel with, unfortunately, generic European hotel Wi-Fi. My apologies. Yes, it sounded like you were right though, Valeria. Like the what do we do in the grey areas is the hard question. My apologies for disappearing.
Yeah, so I think Wilbert or Jane, we kind of tried to jump over, and Wilbert or Jane, if you wanted to take it on the third countries that we know that are aiding Russia in sanctions circumvention, and how how would you advise manufacturers or other clients who are dealing with those jurisdictions? How do they assess this risk in the gray areas?
Yeah, Wilbert, did you want to finish that thought? Sorry.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, Jane, Valeria, Chris. So basically, the risks of dealing with countries that are friendly with Russia depend on the context and of the specific nation we're talking about, and cannot necessarily be matched when speaking of different jurisdictions. For example, it would not be the same to sustain economic activities with, let us say, one of the founding members of the BRICS, the bloc integrated by different economies, including the Russian one, than with Iran, for example. Each case has to be analyzed specifically, and it is very important for businesses to do so with particular care, either directly or preferably with the support of legal and compliance experts. And I do not say this because I'm a lawyer, but because I do think it is the best thing to do for companies. Nonetheless, in case businesses or business are conducted with countries friendly with Russia without attention to the particularities of each matter, companies can face different risks. First, there may be a possibility of being used inadvertently for the circumvention of sanctions imposed against the Russian Federation. This comes from the fact that the heavy sanctions packages imposed over Russia might be, that country, given those sanctions packages, that country might be interested in reducing the effects of those restrictions upon its economy. And one way of doing so would be by using intermediaries in non-sanctioned jurisdictions to conduct business activities. This might also present legal and compliance risks in connection with the countries that are part of the sanctioning coalition against Russia. For example, the United States, as Chris has written, has imposed sanctions not only to Russia, but also to, let's say, Belarus. So doing business with the latter may have unintended legal consequences, as well as reputational ones. Third, the possible use of businesses with third-party jurisdictions to circumvent sanctions against Russia could implicate a financial crime risk spillover, particularly considering that it could constitute a form of money laundering in certain legal systems. Aside from any theoretical definitions, money laundering is fundamentally a process by which illicit funds are concealed and further used. Money laundering requires a predicate offense, that is an illicit activity, from which the illegal resources arise. If funds are derived from a predicate offense, as it could be the circumvention of sanctions, then, and depending on the laws of each jurisdiction, it could constitute a money laundering offense. Fourth, although to a lesser extent, there may be the risk of seizure of assets or investments in favor of the relevant country in analysis, and even of Russia. Even though this risk would depend on the specific nation and could be remote, given the rapidly moving geopolitical situation, it cannot be dismissed entirely. The steps that companies can take in order to hedge against these risks are, for example, first, to determine whether the relevant nation has been included in some sort of restrictions list, like the list of the FATF, the OFAC list, etc. Second, to figure out whether the products to be dealt with are exempted of restrictions. For example, technology that could be used for military purposes may be subject to detailed limitations. Third, to retain legal expert and compliance advice to get assistance on the matter. Although this may seem burdensome to businesses, it would be much worse to face sanctions or even criminal prosecution due to a poorly executed risk analysis, resulting in non-compliance even if unintended. On this, it is important to remember that the ignorance of the law or of legal regulations is not an excuse for their breach. This is very much true with regards to the current regulatory landscape derived from the Russian Federation and its invasion of Ukraine.
Okay. Sorry. Thanks ever so much, Wilbert. And apologies for my occasional disappearances. Hopefully, I'm back now. Jane, I wonder if we could come to you. Looking into 2024, what do you think the main? Thank you very much, Wilbert. What do you think the main things that are we should be looking at in 2024? What are the big threats, and what do you think is changing at the moment?
Sure. So, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes. Yes.
So, thank you, and thank you to everyone listening. So, I think, look, it's hard to speak of this without starting with sanctions, but I do think I would divide that category, that kind of, in two different buckets. There is sort of the primary sanctions when the West is trying to target particular individuals or organizations, state-owned or private, for sanctions because of what they're themselves doing and the support they're providing to Russia, to its military, or to other key sectors of Russian economy. These primary sanctions, to the extent we have reached peak sanctions when it comes to this. Of course, there's still companies being sanctioned, new names are being added to the lists. But if you read kind of more deeply into why they're being added, more often than not, it's because of their connection to other already sanctioned individuals or entities. So even though they're technically speaking primary sanctions, in that these individuals or companies are being added to asset freeze lists, the reasons are more kind of secondary, in that it's not because they themselves directly are usually involved in this activity that we're trying to sanction, but rather are aiding and abetting others. And that leads me to what I see as kind of the main risk when it comes to sanctions in 2024 and beyond. And that is this kind of expanding circles, concentric circles. If you think of kind of the primary goal of the sanctions as being the target, we are expanding out and out from that in terms of trying to capture the ways in which that target is getting, financial resources, supplies it needs, and so on, by sanctioning directly or indirectly this wider and wider circle of organizations. And I think that's where the main risks lie. It's not that we're going to find more direct targets so much as we're going to find, as Russia and its allies are becoming more creative in how they are structuring their operations in order to get what they need, we're going to see increasing ways to try to stop them from doing so through additional sanctions. And I think the December 22 executive order that we've mentioned a number of times is a primary example of that. And this, that is so-called secondary sanctions. This is where the threat is that the US will add to the sanction list these entities. They're not claiming that they actually have direct jurisdiction to find them to have violated existing US sanctions, but rather they themselves will be subject to sanctions if they continue on the path they're on. And this is very much an extraterritorial application of US law, and as such has been quite controversial. I don't think it's controversial in the way it's being applied here, because there is broad consensus when it comes to holding Russia accountable in the West, at least. But generally speaking, as a legal tool, it's quite controversial. So I think we're going to be seeing more of that, and happy to speak more on that particular order and how that is likely to be applied. And then I think,
Jane, sorry, can I ask? So when you talk about, thinking about risks, do you think that is for the average, say, American business, but it could be European or somewhere else? Do you think that poses a risk of being caught up in things? What does that mean for a business?
Yeah, fair enough. So I think it does. It exponentially increases your risk of being caught up, because I think, again, when it comes to primary sanctions to that target, you kind of, I think at this point, 2 years on, most companies, responsible companies who are trying to do the right thing, have figured out a way, screening, etc., to make sure they're not dealing directly with those entities. And I think except in kind of truly sort of relatively rare cases, like they have systems in place to catch those and to make sure they're not dealing with those parties. When it comes to sanctions evasion and circumvention, and companies and individuals that may not be themselves on the sanctions list, and where you need to figure out whether they're actually acting as a proxy, as was discussed in the prior panel around trusts and other, non-transparent arrangements that Russia-related companies and individuals are setting up, it is just exponentially harder for companies to catch that. And this comes both on financial sanctions side and then a huge risk to financial institutions, and also an export control side and policing your distribution chain, essentially figuring out where the leaks are. Is very hard. I mean, we find, it's in the news all the time. This, Ukrainian soldiers are finding Western-made components in Russian drones. And the question is how it got there. And I was just yesterday at a speech given by Matthew Axelrod from the Department of Commerce, who is specifically in charge of export enforcement. And he was talking about the policy changes they are making to focus the limited resources on kind of the key priorities of the department. And this was identified as the #1 priority is how do you stop Western goods making its way into the battlefield, essentially. And where that diversion takes place, it's very difficult, actually, from the perspective of the company that is the manufacturer, to actually figure out where these leaks are.
It's quite striking when you look at the designation lists produced by OFAC, that in November they did a round of sanctioning of people who import basically machine tools, Russian companies. And you look at who these companies are, and they are ostensibly completely civilian companies. They have no overt links. I just wonder about whether how you can advise people in an environment where, first of all, the line between civilian and military is disappearing, and in a place where there's so much less transparency than there was 2 years ago.
Yeah, so I think more and more companies, because of exactly what you said, are being caught up in this issue, because it's not just sort of the military kind of large military multinational, like they know kind of that what they make is highly controlled, etc. They've had these processes for a long time. But then you're now dealing, as you say, with companies that are not actually, I think what I've recently read is about kind of the manufacture of components for regular cameras. Civilian use cameras are being used in drones. One example that actually Department of Commerce gave was literally Coke or Pepsi bottle caps are being used to, like, for some part of the drive, forget the technical term, but like, really sort of civilian items. So you need to be thinking as a company, obviously maybe not quite as far out as a soda bottle, but if you are producing anything that can be used, whether it's not intended for that use or not, that is being used or can be used for in a way that creates high risk of potential sanctions evasion, export controls evasion, you should be thinking about who your your distribution channels are and where those goods are going.
Thank you ever so much, Jane. Justine, I wonder if I can come to you. So, I mean, I have the same question for you, really. How do you feel about, as we turn into 2024, how do you think the environment is changing? And, what advice would you give to businesses that are still doing business in Russia? And, how risky is it at this moment to still be sending things in or dealing with people who are?
So, well, first of all, thanks for the invite to join the panel. I think a lot of the messaging has been given around 2024. I mean, for me, the lens I look at this through is very much is going to be an era of, really, I think, enforcing, particularly around export controls, strategic trade, dual-use goods. And there is a lot of material which has come out there, which people can look at. And what we're also seeing in that space is quite a lot more strategic alliances. So we have the US lists, we have the EU list, we have the UK one on all what they've identified as particularly vulnerable critical goods for, battlefield elements in Russia. But what we're also seeing is some wider alliances. The E5 came out with a number of things. So I think it's really important for people to actually just understand the breadth of all the components. And it's already been explained how broad that is. So I don't need to go over that. But we will see enforcement, and it is going to come from the trade authorities, so BIS and others. So that is something I would say to people. What we're seeing at the moment, and a lot of the conversations we're having, is really not necessarily around direct exposure to Russia, but is the indirect exposure. So that's the bit which is really going to come up to people. How do they manage that? And I'm going to have to keep drinking only because this week I lost my voice and it just started to come back today. So if I cut out, please go to another panelist.
As long as your internet doesn't cut out, we can't go through those.
It's just as bad if the voice cuts out. So that's going to be the really big thing around export controls, trade sanctions, dual-use goods. Keep that in mind. The other big one is around sanctions evasion, and sanctions evasion is such a broad term and covers so many different elements. And I think it's really, again, important for people to understand the key concerns of authorities around sanctions evasion and what they may be particularly exposed to. Now, and I mentioned it earlier, a lot of it's around business through third jurisdictions. And that's going to be the key thing. Could somebody else jump in whilst I get a drink?
Well, I think that I will wonder if we can come to you, maybe, Jane. I have one of the questions we got from, which relates to what we were just talking about, is about whether there are examples of sanctions violations punishment that are not widely known about. Because I think I'm always struck by the fact we get these indictments of this guy who turns out to have like an FSB uniform photo, like 2 months down the line, but we don't actually see a lot of like ordinary companies being punished. I don't think. Is that right?
So they are. I mean, the most active, I would say, in the US, the OFAC has been most active, and they issue a lot of subpoenas. It's civil subpoenas. They don't become public. And this is financial sanctions, not export controls. And they resolve the cases in a number of ways, and some of them are not public, so they can decide to resolve the matter even where kind of a violation is identified without a public resolution. Oftentimes that happens when the company voluntarily reports, which most of them do in the financial sanctions space. If you have a suspicion that you may have violated US sanctions, most companies would go and report that to OFAC. And that often then results in ongoing, kind of communication with OFAC. You need to provide them with information and so on. We do this for many clients. And then you hope that this will result in a non-public resolution, and that's why folks don't see it. There are public enforcement actions that OFAC takes, and it usually issues a press release along with them. And you can see kind of what the facts of the case were and why there wasn't resolution. If you have good lawyers, they will negotiate so that press release goes out on like December 24th. And doesn't get
your fault. It's your fault.
So you may not read about them in the papers, but you can go, and these are published on OFAC's website, and you can see them. Now, the biggest kind of stick in the room is, of course, DOJ and criminal enforcement. It is true that there has been less of that when it comes to kind of well-known sort of quote unquote reputable companies. A lot of the recent DOJ cases have been against individual, kind of the individual you describe and those sorts of cases. I do think we're going to see that changing. In the last year, DOJ has added a very significant number. I don't remember the exact number, but it's a lot of prosecutors to the National Security Division and to the unit in charge of criminal enforcement of sanctions and export controls. They also added 2 senior roles as a head and vice head of corporate enforcement specifically. So this has been a real focus. So in those cases have a longer lead time. So I would assume kind of the fruits of all of that staffing up to happen in 24 and 25 and subsequently.
we'll come back to Justine in a second, but Jane, I wonder if I could ask one more thing on that thought, which is just on X. So we mentioned OFAC there, DOJ indictments, and the other one is export control, sort of EAR breaches. I wonder do you know in a sense of how active that is?
So yes, so they are becoming, so that is not traditionally kind of the agency you think of. I think OFAC has more of history than BIS in this space, but they're very much looking to change that. And Matthew Axelrod, whom I mentioned, that has been his mission. They had a big resolution last year. Seagate is the name of the company. It does not involve Russia. It's actually China-related export controls matter. But it was, I believe, a $300 million resolution, which is by far the largest that BIS has had. And they're very much signaling that that's what they've set their sights on, big, meaty cases, and trying to get kind of smaller technical violations to get through the pipeline quicker so that they can focus on these.
Okay. Thank you ever so much. Sorry, Justine, can we come back to you?
I'll try and keep the voice. My teenagers are loving the fact that I've not been able to speak all week, is what I would say. I think there's just one thing I would flag to people to look at, and it's a UK publication, but the messaging is actually so useful for global firms with a European or US footprint. And it was actually the Financial Conduct Authority. They produced a thematic review of sanctions, and they listed a number of common failings around due diligence, screening, mapping exposure, management information. And what I would say is what they mapped and what they identified is what we commonly see as concerns from the more Western regulators. So do look at that. Even if you don't have a UK footprint, I think the messaging there is pretty consistent for many authorities. And I just can't emphasize enough the what's just been said around DOJ and BIS. They are going to become much more important, particularly around trade control. So if you have exposure to trade, you really need to think that. Now, this is raising a huge issue for the banks because their compliance teams and their their sanctions teams and the export control teams normally sit in different areas, different skill sets, different materials that they look at, different type of risk decisions. They're having to bring that together. And we hosted a whole lot of roundtables globally last year on this. And without exception, the senior executives were saying this is what's keeping them awake at night. Do we have the right teams? Are we even practically able to do this? So there's a big question mark for the banks to say, how do they go into this level of detail around transactions which are linked to trade, and actually understanding, is the trade then ultimately going to end up in Russia? So that's a big one. The other thing I would say is, there's been a lot of focus today around Executive Order 14114. I think what's going to be quite key is to see how that's going to be used over the next few months, because secondary sanctions are all about threat, and it's all, and overall, we've actually seen threat, use of secondary sanctions fairly limited. So it will be really interesting to see whether we're going to see this executive order really utilized in a larger way, and if so, who they're targeting, and also whether that executive order will be expanded to logistic providers and others, so beyond foreign financial institutions. And keep in mind, foreign financial institutions is quite a broad thing. The other thing I would say on that is, really, if people haven't really managed to get their head around secondary sanctions, do that, and particularly around significant transactions. What does that really mean, and how can you manage that? And it does pose, and I know we've got a couple of lawyers on the panel, so I'm sure they'll come in, but it does pose real challenges for those who are already committed to Russia business. How do they withdraw from that? So if, let's say, you're already engaged in a long-term contract with Russia to provide goods, and because of the fear of secondary sanctions, you think, actually, I want to withdraw from that. What is your legal basis to do that? So there will be a lot of companies really struggling with thinking about that. And I'll pause there.
Well, okay. Do you want to take a drink of water, Justine? Because I'm going to quickly come back to you, if that's all right. So we've got a question from from one of our viewers asking, what is the compliance exposure for FIAs, so financial institutions, who unknowingly participate or facilitate sanctions evasion, especially through indirect participation through a third-party jurisdiction? I assume they didn't. They're listed as random guy rather than like giving their corporate email address. Unfortunately, on the I don't know which bank I should be looking into. But Justine, I wonder if you could help.
And so the question is really around management to indirect. How do they do that? So I think it really depends on if they're a bank or if they're a corporate, because the obligations on banks and corporates are quite different. You know, banks do have due diligence frameworks. They are required to have due diligence in place. If you are a corporate, you do not have the same data set of your customers unless you're absolutely deliberately doing that to understand the risk. So I would say there's two different answers here. For banks, there is one, and it is about understanding, looking at the red flags. We're just actually about to put out a sanctions evasion toolkit. I don't want to, it's awful to come on these panels and promote these things, but there's so much out there. And, there is a number of red flags you can use to identify using your due diligence around, people who, have established their companies after a certain point, how they're trading, what they're trading. A number of people have just already spoken about this. So there is some frameworks that the banks can use. It becomes much more difficult for the corporates if they're not dealing in a particular type of sensitive good where it's got an end-to-end license. If they're just dealing with, they're supplying something to Turkey, they've had a long-standing relationship, they don't necessarily know. So it is going to be a bit of a mind change, a change in mindset for the corporates, I would say. And it could be quite a significant one as well.
Thanks ever so much. I wonder, John, if we could come back to you. One of the things that I'm really struck by about, particularly in talking to lawyers at the moment, is around the increasing complexity of compliance. And I guess from your perch as a campaigner on cleaning up global finance, do you worry that the complexity is an obstacle, or do you think that actually fundamentally this is a complicated world and you need tools that are complicated?
Yeah, no, it's never been as complex. If you look back, dealing with sanctions used to be about addressing known entities, essentially, and screening against those to prevent infractions. And as the panelists have been talking about, the biggest risk now is that that's got to be a given, that you've got systems and controls. They're able to do that, even though the volume creates real challenges in relation to processing and timeliness and friction and all that kind of stuff. The reality now is the biggest risk is this indirect risk that people were talking about, and the fact that you do not know who are the people that you don't want to do business with, because they're new intermediaries, or they're intermediaries that are trying to obfuscate the connection with Russia. So it's a really difficult task there, and it's never been as complex. Sanctions have never been as complex. The risks have never been as challenging. But at least the control framework that some of the bigger institutions have got are pretty mature, and we've seen some of this before. And so there is knowledge about how to deal with it. But I would say, in answer to that last question from Random Guy, that the technical answer is yes, you are exposed if it's a significant transaction, and if it's a relevant transaction, even if you didn't know, and it's a payment from your customer, you are liable. I think the view is that you're not going to be the ones who are going to be targets. It's going to be the ones that do know and or have very large transactions that have been dealing with Russia knowingly. But technically, yep, you're caught.
Can I, Wilbert, I wonder if we could come back to you. We're just looking down a list of some of our questions, some of which are I quite like what proportion basically of your clients do you think are crooks, and which ones do you think are innocently caught? But I don't think it's fair to ask you to try and answer that one. I wonder, there's quite a technical question, but it's one that really interests journalists in particular. There's a lot of questions circulating around general licenses and their acceptance to pay professional fees. That's obviously something of great concern to lawyers, but also to journalists who are wondering if we can get sued by anyone in Russia anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Well, basically, General licenses are authorizations provided by or given by authorities to conduct certain transactions in limited specific circumstances that otherwise would not be allowed, right? Given the sanctions and financial crimes legal regimes. Now, of course, it's a complicated question because again, it would depend on the specific circumstances of which professional fees are being paid for. So all the fact elements around the specific scenario need to be taken into consideration in order to determine whether those payments could actually be made or not. But again, it would be a matter of, number one, assessing the factual elements, the information that financial institutions have when asked for making those payments, number one. Number two would be a matter of analyzing whether those cases, whether those situations are covered by the applicable general licenses. And number three would be a matter of, financial institutions have experts and also can come for legal experts in order to determine whether it is adequate to make those payments. So given all those considerations, it is necessary to make a risk analysis and then come up to a specific answer on each case in a case-by-case basis.
Thanks. This obviously, I should point out that the UK gave a license to Yevgeny Prigozhin to bring a libel case in London. So it's a topic very dear to our heart. Noted culinary entrepreneur Yevgeny Prigozhin. Justine, I wonder if we could come back to you just on that thought about how general licenses interacts with secondary sanctions.
Yeah, so this is again going to be one of the real big challenges for the non-US entities, how they manage that sanctions licensing landscape, because the Russia sanctions are so complex. There is a lot of elements within there in terms of general licenses, which will not apply to non-US entities. However, under the secondary sanctions framework and other areas, they sort of seem to say that will apply. So that's going to be something that really they should push on. The other thing, and I know we're coming to a close, but the other thing I would say is the scope for non-US entities to actually seek a specific license from the US, again, can be quite limited. However, what we've seen previously around secondary sanctions is a real encouragement from the US authorities for companies to reach out to them if they have that, even though they may not be directly applicable for a specific license. So the next 6 months are going to raise a lot of complex legal issues around licensing and how that applies. And I'll pause there.
Thanks. I think with that, that's a good moment for us to pause and for me to hand over to Valeria. For my part, thank you to Jane, Justine, to Wilbert, and to John for their expertise. They know things, whereas I just write down things other people say.
Дуже дякую за увагу. До побачення.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the panelists, and thank you so much, Chris, for moderating. And we will be sharing the recording with everybody who's registered, as well as with the speakers. There will also be a write-up of insights that will be shared with the audience. And I hope that these insightful conversations that we've had today will spark more conversations among the business, political, and legal community. And we will continue to do more to counter the risks that Russia poses. Thank you so much for taking the time and for all the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.